will try to send you a really quick orientation video every other day or so, just to let you know where things stand and how things are going. First of all, this is our first discussion, and it is wonderful. I am really delighted that so many of you have already made your videos, and I encourage you to look at those and talk to each other. You also had really interesting comments about the Black Book. The next thing to show you is our syllabus, and of course the dog has to bark. This is the printable page, 6-page version, and this is a version that I will update frequently. Now, our course outcomes include exploring activist traditions that go back several centuries, and I would include our founders in that tradition, particularly using the different disciplines of religion, music, gender equality, and politics to understand the historical developments in the modern world, the ways that African Americans contributed to them particularly. The critical language of African American studies and the key scholars in the discipline is a little switch that we're making as we go from talking about the founders and Thomas Jefferson in the background of the field to our first scholar example this week, which is Sylvia Frey. So if you look ahead to Module 4, which I call the Real Scholars, we have, and you can click on the name of anything to open it. It won't hurt anything. We have Sylvia Frey, who is a Tulane historian, professor emeritus. I'm going to hit that dog over the head. No! No, thank you. And what I will do in these parts that are about scholars is first have a little background information about them that you can just take a quick peek at to know who the person is that contributed the scholarship that we're talking about for that day. And then there is a mini lecture. It's 18 minutes on Sylvia Frey. At the end, it's not as important, so I would say definitely try to pay attention to the first 15 minutes. And this is the visuals from the mini lecture. It's called a sway, and if you click play, you can see the images that I use in the mini lecture so that it's a little bit more engaging. Then I have a quiz about the chapter, which is also very close to the mini lecture, and here is where you can access the whole book or just look at the PDF. Now, I've had a lot of trouble lately with PDFs, so if you cannot use the PDF, then you log into the library and you find this book From Toussaint to Tupac, and you'll be able to get a copy, an HTML copy of the chapter that way. Next week, our next real scholar will be Professor Eddie Glaude. But before we jump ahead to next week, I also added another founder to this folder about Sylvia Frey, and that is Lemieux Haynes. Here is the founding project, and here is an article about him. He was biracial, excuse me, a white mother and an African father, born in Connecticut. And part of why Lemieux Haynes is so important, and I had to include him, is because his pamphlet, Liberty Further Extended, is the first publication in the United States to quote the Declaration of Independence. So keep that in mind. The first person to quote the Declaration of Independence in the United States is a black man. And the document, which you can read for yourself, it looks a little funny because they did not have standardized spelling in 1776. But here's our quote of we hold these truths to be self-evident. Then we have some points that seem very similar to those we see from Samson Occam, John Merritt, and Phyllis Wheatley. Liberty is an innate principle. Freedom is an innate principle placed in our hearts by the Creator, a jewel handed down to man from the cabinet of heaven. And any man who boasts superiority over another of natural privilege but can't convince us in his arguments of his preeminence we should suspect. That's basically what he is saying. Yes, an Englishman has a right to his liberty. We see this, but why should we confine liberty to any other nation? And what he says essentially is that liberty is for all. Liberty is for people of African descent. And he adds with some biblical references, it hath pleased God to make of one blood all nations of men, which I believe he says is from Acts. I thought it was Psalm, but I might be mixing up my biblical verses. That happens a lot. So that's Lemieux Haynes. I wanted you to have a quick look at Lemieux Haynes. Another thing that I noticed from the discussions that I would like to cover as quickly as possible is many of you asked about or brought up the question of voodoo or Voodoo. This book is by a scholar named Kate Ramsey, and it was published fairly recently. Let me see, that publication date is 2011. It is a book about voodoo, but it's not what you would expect. It's about the ways that the idea of voodoo becomes a way to denigrate, create prejudice and myths, and demonize people of African descent. She quotes this man named Arthur Holly, who says, accusations according to which our African fathers have bequeathed to us a degrading and diabolic cult have very much contributed to maintaining the black race in a deplorable state of social segregation in Haiti as in elsewhere. So what this Haitian man is saying during the first occupation of Haiti by the United States from 1915 to 1932, I believe, what he's saying is these myths and lies about Haiti that say our African ancestors bestowed upon us a diabolic cult are for the purpose of racism, for the purpose of keeping us down. So Ramsey goes on to point out the ways that lies about Haiti and about Africa and African religions developed in the course of Haitian history in writings by French and American visitors to Haiti. In this article, Myths of Voodoo Worship and Child Sacrifice in Haiti, published in 1888, you have to pay attention to the word myths, okay? Voodoo is essentially a dance. It's a connection to Dahomey religious practices. It has nothing to do with the devil or with child sacrifice. And in looking at all of the legal depositions against Haitian peasants who practiced Vodun or voodoo, this folklorist discovered that every single horrific story written about the Haitian peasants directly corresponds with a story written about French peasants in the late 1500s who were part of a different religious sect. And he concludes, therefore, that all of these stories about Vodou, including devil worship, child sacrifice, cannibalism, and all of the horrors and horrific things said about voodoo are false because they are all of European origin. They are all based on similar lies that Europeans waged against this other group of Europeans who were Christian peasants who they murdered and called witches in the 1500s. As you know, there were witch trials in the United States in Salem, and therefore the idea of this witch hunt, this demonization, racism, is something that we can connect directly to the United States as well. And I've done a little bit more research into the ways that that Americans and the French have worked together to tell these lies, white Americans particularly, to tell these lies about Vodun and to create a sensational and very negative idea about African religion. So that's all I have for today. Just to remind you that with the way our Blackboard page is set up, probably looks different to you, but all you need to do is click on the names of things. And if you want to see everything in a module, you click the arrow and several items will open. Don't worry about things you might see appearing in the grade book that are not yet available. Those are for the ongoing build of the class. So don't worry about it if it doesn't have a due date. And if it does have a due date also, don't worry too much. Due dates are just recommendations to help you pace yourself and keep up. Let me know what questions you have. Thanks for these wonderful posts that I've seen already. The due date is 5/10, but I look forward to the other 4 people in the class participating as well. I know Blackboard told you you were late. I don't consider you late. I know we all have lives. So have a great day.